your conference name?
Stensrud.
Yeah.
Okay, let me introduce to you our next speaker. It's Tim Daniel. He's a partner in the London office of the US law firm Edwards Wildman, where he practices public international law, and in particular, asset recovery for states which has been looted by their leaders. And that's not few, as we have seen in the former presentations. Mr. Daniel's presentation is called Abacha, the kleptocrat's legacy, and looks into how assets were recovered after the former Nigerian dictator and kleptocrat, General Sani Abacha, and which lesson that can be learned from this. Please, Tim Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first let me thank the organisers and the Norwegian government for hosting this very, very valuable conference. We've already had two absolutely amazing presentations. I listened with complete fascination to both the previous speakers. It's not my fault that I get the graveyard slot after lunch, but I know why it was given to me. I am a lawyer. I am in private practice. I have all those evil thoughts that were referred to before. And one of the evil thoughts that occurred to me was that that the title of this conference, Financial Secrecy, Society and Vested Interests, could very easily be adapted to the Financial Secrecy Society, and vested interests, because it is about the Financial Secrecy Society really that we are concerned today, and the effect of vested interests in keeping it secret, as we saw particularly in the last presentation. So I have since 1976 I have represented the government of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, first of all when they had a big problem with cement back in the 70s. And they were basically conned into buying a whole load of cement, which they were going to build military barracks with all around the country. And of course, there were huge scams surrounding that. And although we, first of all, pleaded state immunity and succeeded before the English courts, we then were overturned. And the appeal judge, Lord Denning, said that countries which take on commercial obligations must honour them, and then there was legislation passed. So I went to the Nigerian government and I said, look, all these contracts were basically obtained through corruption. You are producing a report on this. Perhaps I could be permitted to see the report, and then I could defend some of these cases, because the liability of the Nigerian government ran into tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds on these contracts. And I was told that the report, which had been produced by the eminent Nigerian judge, could be seen by the head of state, the chief of the general staff, and the attorney general, but that it would not be suitable for the country's lawyers to see this report. And the reason for that, of course, was that all these cases were being settled, and that gave everybody the chance of a second bite of the cherry, because the settlement sums were huge, and those arranging the settlements made a lot of money from that process. So there we are. That was the Nigeria in which, in a sense, I grew up and acted for the government over many years. And then in 1998, General Sani Abacha, who had been one of the most unpleasant dictators that Nigeria had suffered under, suddenly died. And his immediate successor, Abdul Salami Abubakar, who was an interim military leader, first thing he said was, we are going to try and get the money back, which the Abachas have stolen. And I suppose that's really where I came in again. I had been handling a very large boundary dispute for Nigeria with their neighbour Cameroon, which was before the International Court of Justice at the time. And so it was natural in a way that they should turn to my firm in connection with all the looted monies. So as we heard before lunch, Abacha took is reckoned to have taken between 3 and 5 billion. Last year, or I think it was last year or the year before, the World Bank published some figures which were really quite startling, which said that between 20 and 40 billion is transferred in illicit funds each year, mainly from undeveloped countries from developing countries to the developed countries. And the money, of all that money which had been stolen, only 5 billion had, to that date, been recovered. And the figure that was given before lunch of 3 billion having been recovered in the Abacha case is about right. So over half of that money which has been recovered is actually attributable to the Abacha case. Abacha himself, he basically looted the central bank of Nigeria. He simply got his national security advisors to write him letters saying that huge sums of money were needed in order to counter the threats to national security, which were posed by unnamed individuals and organizations. And he started off by asking for $2 million. By the end, he was asking for $500 million. And those letters would be written to him, sent to Abacha, countersigned by Abacha, and then the money would be transferred to the commercial sector, and the commercial sector would transfer that money out to Abacha-controlled accounts, or it would be converted into traveller's checks, and huge sums were taken out simply in cash and traveller's checks. 1.2 billion went through the City of London, and that was where we came in, because what happened after the interim government incidentally negotiated a deal with the Abacha family whereby they would return the money that had been stolen and in return for an amnesty. Well, they returned about $750 million, but they didn't get an amnesty because basically the government said, you must be joking. That is not all the money that you've taken, and so we'll take that money, thank you, but we're not going to give up pursuing you. So when Obasanjo was democratically elected in 1999, beginning of 1999, May 1999, a special investigation panel was set up under a senior policeman, and he started gathering information, interviewing witnesses, and collecting the papers relating to this huge theft. At the same time, Obasanjo wrote to Switzerland, to the Swiss government, and said, we think a lot of this money's ended up in Switzerland, can you help us? And it was almost as informal as that. We talk about mutual legal assistance, but mutual legal assistance can operate on a very informal level. And as a result of that letter, the Swiss, who were reeling from the Holocaust revelations and the fact that many of the Jews who'd been exterminated in the Second World War, their monies were held by Swiss banks, and the interest that those monies had earned had basically been financing the Swiss banking sector for a long time, and it was very shaming for Switzerland. And so Switzerland wanted to get some better publicity, and so they bent over backwards to help the Nigerian effort. And a letter was sent to all financial institutions in Switzerland, all 11,000 of them, basically from the government, saying, if you have any accounts which you think may be connected with Abacha, will you please tell us about them? And that produced a huge response. And interestingly, it is a technique which is still used by Switzerland, because, of course, one of the legacies of Abacha and his kleptocracy has been that the world has become much more aware of this problem. It's not perfect yet, but still a lot of the money does go through secrecy jurisdictions like Switzerland, and Switzerland has been at the forefront of fighting this. And I think that the most recent example probably is the attempts to recover money on behalf of the Egyptians stolen by Mubarak. And within half an hour of Mubarak's fall, Switzerland had imposed financial sanctions on all accounts relating to Mubarak and his cronies. And that was a really, really impressive response. And those monies continue to be frozen. Contrast that with the actions of the UK government, it took them 37 days to impose sanctions, and they said they had to wait for the European Union before they imposed those sanctions. Whereas we all know money can travel much faster than that, and so by the time the sanctions were imposed, surprise, surprise, there wasn't an awful lot left. And the reaction of the British government in the Mubarak case is, I'm afraid, very, very familiar to me, because what happened back in 2002 was that an application was made by the Abacha government to the British authorities for mutual legal assistance in order to try and get money back in the Abacha case. The Financial Services Authority issued a press release after about 2 months of investigation and said that $1.2 billion had been laundered through the City of London. It wasn't still held in the UK. It had gone to banks in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Channel Islands, etc. But they said that the banks which had been involved had been spoken to, that their compliance with money laundering regulations, which were then admittedly in their infancy, left a great deal to be desired, but they'd been spoken to. So when we were instructed on the matter, we wrote to the banks and said, or wrote to the Financial Services Authority and said, would you like to tell us which these banks were? Oh no, they said, that would be in breach of our banking laws. So we didn't get any joy from that. Furthermore, the Nigerian government got no joy from its mutual legal assistance requests. And the Financial Times published a headline in which they highlighted the FSA report and basically said it was a disgrace that there had been no move by the British authorities to assist the Nigerians to date. And so we went to see the Home Office, which is the ministry in charge of giving mutual legal assistance, and we said, look, what are you going to do about this? And they said, oh, well, it's all very difficult. We can't find any laws in Nigeria which actually prevent the head of state from taking any money out of the country. And so how would he be prosecuted? I mean, that was almost the level of the response. So I wrote to Abacha and said, look, what you're facing here is the sound of doors slamming in your face, because the City of London is extremely important to the UK economy. We make more money from our invisible exports than we do from any other trade. And so the city had a vested interest in preserving its preeminence in this field. So I said, the other thing that you could do is actually to commence proceedings in the civil courts in the UK, in England, and the weapons that you can use in civil proceedings are actually very similar to what you can use in criminal proceedings. You don't have the advantage of coercion, but you do have discovery, you can freeze assets, and you can force disclosure under civil procedures. So we did that, and within 6 weeks, the Abachas knew nothing about the action that we were taken because it can be done in secret. And within 6 weeks, we had information on all the accounts which had been held in the UK and all those banks that had been involved. It took the Home Office 4 years to transfer that information to Nigeria. So I use that as an example of how you can actually, you don't need necessarily to rely totally on government MLA resources to get the information. Al-Masaya was another Nigerian case, a Nigerian governor who took 40 million. There the scenario was slightly different. He was actually arrested when he came to Britain, and the police accompanied him to his flat, and there they found £1 million stashed in drawers and wardrobes, etc., in the flat, and said, "What's all this?" And he said, "Oh, I didn't know. I don't know who put that there." And so he was granted police bail, and then a fortnight later he left the country, it was said, disguised as a lady, which reminded me of the story of Mr. Toad in The Wind in the Willows, who, of course, escaped disguised as a washerwoman. Anyway, he did skip the jurisdiction, and he never came back. That was the cue, again, for civil proceedings, because in criminal proceedings you need a defendant there. And so we spoke to the Metropolitan Police and said, look, if you hand over the evidence to us, we could continue this through the civil courts. And basically that was what happened. We applied to the civil courts for an order requiring the police to hand over their evidence to us, and with that evidence we were eventually able to secure judgments against Al-Masseer, and about 40 million has been recovered to date. Darrier was another Nigerian governor, similar story. Ibori I'll come back to. I should say at this stage that unfortunately I shall have to stop at 5 to 2 because the television people want to film me outside, so I have to go outside for a 2 o'clock broadcast. But I will try and come back to the rest of the slides in this presentation, which have mainly to do with another Nigerian governor called James Ibori. Mobutu we heard about before lunch. Chiluba was the president of Zambia, and in a very high profile case, he was found guilty basically of having taken 50 million. It wasn't a case that we dealt with. I don't know that any of that money has so far been returned to Zambia, partly because when the matter came before the Zambian courts, he was found not guilty. And the magistrate who returned that verdict, his court rose one Friday afternoon, and he was due to hand down his judgment on the Monday, and between that Friday afternoon and Monday morning, he was taken away to an undisclosed location in the company of top Zambian officials, and the judgment that he was going to write magically transformed from a guilty judgment to a not guilty judgment. And that is the story that I have, and one rather fears that it may be true. Obiang, the Obiang family the interview has been postponed till 2:30, so I can go on for an extra 5 minutes. You'll be sad to hear. The Obiang family are basically the family in charge of Equatorial Guinea. And some of you may have read of some really quite extraordinary things that have been happening in relation to their wealth, which is an extraordinary coup for civil society, in the sense that two NGOs, an NGO called Sherpa, together with Transparency International, were able to persuade the courts in France that investigating magistrates should be appointed to investigate the wealth of the Obiang family. They have a huge apartment on the Avenue Foch, and they have various other properties around France. And after going up to the Cour de Cassation, the highest appeal court in France, and back down again, they were eventually able to get an investigation opened. And amongst other things, one has seen photographs of the car transporter parked outside the address in Avenue Foch, loaded with Bugatti Veyrons, Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, Range Rovers, which were about to be shipped out to Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea, at the last count, I think it had probably 50 kilometers of tarmac road. So, obviously there was a question as to why the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea, who was admittedly a minister in the Equatorial Guinean government, the Ministry of Forestry, and he had a salary, I think it may have been as much as $40,000 a year, and yet there he was about to transport all this hardware to Equatorial Guinea. And at that stage, the Americans started getting interested, and they collared an account in the US with $70 million in it, and also Obiang Jr.'s beach house in Malibu, and probably most significantly from his point of view, all his Michael Jackson memorabilia. So he's been deprived of all those for the time being. And of course, Equatorial Guinea, its wealth comes from oil, and that wealth stays firmly in the hands of the ruling family and its immediate cronies. And the population of Equatorial Guinea, it's not a very large population, it's probably not even 1 million people, but they continue to live in poverty below $1 or $2 a day. And of course, that is a story that anybody who studies these things is very familiar with, that the few hold on to the money and the rest of the country suffers, and child mortality rises, and fresh water is denied, and disease is rife. And it's left to philanthropists like Bill Gates providing mosquito nets, actually, to bring down the incidence of malaria. But it's not done by the government. And this is a terrible state of affairs, and it is really one which needs to be tackled. President Bongo of Gabon, succeeded by his son, Bongo Jr., and the Senate committee which investigates these things in America, led by Carl Levin, who's a great hero of mine because he exposes these characters and what they're up to. And there's a report, 4 case studies which came out a couple of years ago, which included Bongo, Obiang, and the former Nigerian Vice President Atiku Abubakar, and an Angolan leader, and basically exposed all the malfeasance that they'd been up to. And one of the interesting things that came out of that report was how extraordinarily lax the money laundering laws are in the United States. And these guys have been able to buy real property, they've been able to purchase aircraft, etc., and nobody asked any questions. And again, that's something which I'll come back to in the context of Ibori. Ngweso is the Republic of Congo, not DRC. Nobody knows how much he's taken, but he is one of the people who is under investigation by the French magistrates because he owns an awful lot of property in France. Then we've got the Arab League, the Arab Spring leaders, Ben Ali, Mubarak and Gaddafi. Mubarak, as I say, I have this awful sense of déjà vu because the government in the UK has been extraordinarily slow in taking any action. Some of you may have seen recently a Newsnight programme in which I feature briefly, in which the Newsnight team put documents in front of me. One of them was an entry from the land registry which showed that Gamal Mubarak, the eldest son, who was so-called investment banker in London, showed that his house at Wilton Place, which is just behind Harrods and which is worth at least £10 million, the land registry was innocent of any type of caution being registered in order to ensure that if he tried to sell that property, notice would be given to the British government, which had, after all, imposed sanctions on the property of Mubarak and 19 of his cronies and their families. They would have no knowledge if he tried to sell it. And interestingly, it was owned through a Cypriot, Panamanian company, which was owned in turn by a Cypriot company. And again, we saw before lunch how much control there is in Cyprus on the registration of companies. So that was one document. There was another document which showed that the wife of the Minister of Housing had been able to set up a company in London just 3 or 4 months previously, which was 6 months after the sanctions had been imposed. And again, there appeared to be no questions asked. She was just able to form this company. She lives in Chelsea, and with impunity, she could form an English company to do whatever it was that she wanted to do. So there's just a total lack of supervision or control once these sanctions have been imposed, in my view. And the BBC Arabic service made an excellent documentary, which is about an hour long, and which I will make available to the organisers. I've only got the first 2 parts, but I hope to have all 3 parts. It's a very, very good expose of what happened under Mubarak and the difficulties which are faced in trying to go after his monies, because nearly 2 years later, not a single penny has been recovered, and the British government has seemingly done virtually nothing. So much so that when David Cameron was recently in New York at the same time as Mohamed Morsi, they were both at the UN, Cameron, it was shortly after the Newsnight presentation, was kind of embarrassed into having to say to Morsi, well, we're very sorry nothing's been recovered so far, despite the assurances which have been given by William Hague in the House of Commons immediately after Mubarak's downfall, when he'd said that UK would leave no stone unturned in returning monies to the Egyptian people. In fact, so forcible was his presentation that the next day, apparently, in Tahrir Square, Egyptians were there with their carpet bags wide open, waiting for their share of the returned monies to be popped into the bags. Sadly, they are still waiting because nothing has happened. And a Foreign Office minister came on television to explain why nothing had happened. And basically he said, well, it's all terribly difficult and you have to get a criminal conviction before you can confiscate. Well, you don't actually have to get a criminal conviction. None of these guys are in the jurisdiction. There's something called non-conviction based recovery, which the World Bank is very keen on, not non-conviction-based asset recovery, and there is also the possibility of civil proceedings. And you would have thought that these would be 2 avenues which the government would be interested in pursuing, but not so. The mutual legal assistance requests, which have been presented to the UK by the Egyptians, have just been sent back with a whole lot more questions being asked. And it seems that there is a kind of mental block in the government on the idea of civil asset recovery, and yet that probably does offer the best means to make recoveries in these Arab Spring countries, because they're never going to get these people before the courts in the UK, so just go after the assets. It's not so difficult. Gaddafi, well, it'd be interesting to see what happens there. Some money has been recovered, but it's still a bit of a melting pot in Libya. Mugabe I just put in because everybody says he's been taking a lot of money, he's been selling blood diamonds, etc., etc. But of course he's still in power, and so he enjoys immunity. Anglo leasing was a Kenyan case, some of you may be familiar with, where basically nearly $1 billion was spirited out of the Kenyan economy with a series of false contracts. We were instructed in that matter a few years back, and we have got precisely nowhere. Why have we got nowhere? Because at every turn we find our way being blocked by basically officials in Kenya. And if you can't get cooperation assistance from the requesting country, you are rather stuck. And of course that's the kind of excuse that the British are using with the Egyptians too. But there are other things that can be done, and it just needs a political will on the part, I think, of our government to actually start doing some of those things. Sorry, I'm getting close to the end of my time anyway. Marcos, I think most people know about that. That was actually recovered. That 624 million was put in escrow account, and it's now being paid out. It was recovered by the Swiss, and it was paid out once the Swiss were satisfied that there was a non-corrupt leader in charge in the Philippines. In the case of Abacha, half a billion was recovered through the Swiss courts, and when it came to returning that money, the president and his finance minister had to give assurances to the Swiss government that the money would be spent well. Some of it's been spent well, but my civil society friends tell me that by no means all of it has been spent well. Zadari, we were pursuing the the proceeds of sale of some properties in the Isle of Man, which were bought by Zardari before he became president. He, you recall, was known as Mr. 10%. Some people said he was Mr. 30% or even Mr. 50%, because that was the percentage he took from government contracts, particularly shipment contracts, and became enormously wealthy, as did his wife, Benazir Bhutto. And they had this country estate in Surrey, very desirable place, and we had a liquidator appointed over the Isle of Man companies, and at first the beneficial ownership was somewhat obscure, but then Zardari realized that he was going to lose his money unless he owned up, so he said, yeah, no, I'm the beneficial owner, what's the problem? So the problem then became actually the Isle of Man courts, and they were so slow and put up so many blocks in our attempts to basically get this money for distribution that we applied to the English court to have the actions transferred to England in order to get some sensible judgments and some sensible action on the case. Zardari had pleaded that he was mentally unfit to instruct his lawyers, that he was suffering from severe depression, and that he simply wasn't capable of answering the questions that his lawyers put to him. This is a very common syndrome amongst these people. We were interested to see pictures of him partying in New York, which is where he was living at the time. And so our own psychiatrist was poised to go in, but then things moved forward quite quickly in England, and we got to within 1 week of signing judgment against Zardari for all the money that we'd got. And lo and behold, sadly, his wife was assassinated. He was elected president. And within days of his being elected president, we were disinstructed, and the liquidator was told to hand over the money to the government, i.e. to Zardari. So I'm afraid that the people of Pakistan are extremely unlikely ever to have seen that money. So these are the sorts of things that can happen. Suharto, we have at the moment 40 million euros frozen in Guernsey, which was collected by Tommy Suharto. Tommy Suharto was Suharto Sr.'s favourite son, and unlike Master Obiang, who went out and bought all those cars, including 1 or 2 Lamborghinis, Tommy Suharto went out and bought Lamborghini. So he bought the whole company. And then he sold it, and he said, well, this is the proceeds of sale of Lamborghini. And it wasn't until we'd been through several appeals before one of the appeal court judges in Guernsey, and these are QCs from England, asked the question, well, how come that Tommy Suharto, at the tender age of 20, was able to amass sufficient money to purchase Lamborghini? That question, of course, remains unanswered, and we don't know, because now the case is effectively being taken over by the Guernsey Financial Services Authority, whether they are going to be allowed to hang on to that money and return it to Indonesia, or whether they're going to be told, well, you haven't produced any proof, because we tried to get judgments against Tommy 4 times in the civil courts in Indonesia, and each time we failed. And it may partly be because when he was convicted of corruption, the judge who found him guilty of corruption 2 weeks later was shot through the head. And Tommy went to jail on suspicion of having been involved in that. He has served his jail sentence, and he's out and about again now. But it's hardly surprising that people aren't terribly keen to give evidence when you've got those kind of people around. That was another problem. Duvalier, that was just put in there for the business of the monies in Switzerland, which were about to be returned to Haiti when, of course, the earthquake struck literally on the eve of the money being returned, and the Swiss government panicked and passed a law which basically said that they could hang on to the money, and that law is still in place and basically allows the Swiss government to intervene in cases where they think that law and order has broken down in the victim country. And that potentially is extremely useful, and one would like to see it extended to other jurisdictions. Now, I've really, I'm afraid, run out of time. I was going to show you I think I'll adopt the last speaker's technique and just run through these slides, which are mainly pictures. But they do actually illustrate an interesting point, because you'll see quite a lot of the houses and the cars and things which he purchased. One of the speakers, the speaker immediately before lunch, said, you know, the remedy in these cases begins here, begins with us. And we've just had in the UK the experience of Margaret Hodge, who chairs our Public Accounts Committee, grilling the CEOs or financial officers of Amazon, Starbucks and Google, asking them why they pay no tax in the UK. And basically they said, oh, well, all the usual excuses which were explained to us this morning. And so Margaret Hodge has urged us all to stop going to Starbucks, to stop ordering our goods through Amazon. I think stopping using Google is going to be more difficult. But you know, that is an example of the kind of action that civil society can take. And in these pictures that you're about to see, you could ask why the people who sold him the cars and sold him the houses, who are subject to our money laundering laws also, asked no questions when this guy, who earned, I think at the time, he was on a salary of about $40,000 a year, was able to afford all these luxury goods. Anyway, he's been sent down for 13 years. He was, as you see, a pupil of Sani Abacha, and there's no doubt that he hoped to be president. He was governor of Delta State, one of the richest oil states in Nigeria, and he was amassing his war chest. That's the only explanation that's been given for Abacha accumulating all the money that he had. It was a war chest for the next election, but the only trouble with that argument was that the next election was only going to have one candidate, and you can guess who that was. So these are just some of the properties. Here are his those who helped him, his mistress, Mr. Gohill, a lawyer in Mayfair. When the police raided his premises, they found these compromising documents hidden up the chimney in his offices, and that led to a lot of revelations. So here's Bentley Continental, fleet of Range Rovers. He owned property in South Africa, as did Al Nasser. The amount of money which Ibori has taken, there are various factors. This is his house in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria. It's put generally at 50 million, but the English courts are now going through the process of confiscation, and that should lead to an assessment of his assets. And it'll be very interesting to see what they come up with, and we won't know probably for another few months what the actual sums involved are. And it will also be an interesting test of the ability of our authorities to get at these assets. That was his lawyer, and that was his wife. These people are all in jail now. And this was all done on the strength of money laundering. And it was much easier to convict them for money laundering than it would have been to convict them on corruption charges. And we see that as the way forward, because the money which these people bring into the country is undoubtedly the proceeds of crime in their home countries, and it's so much easier to go for money laundering. And so perhaps that is the way forward. Of course, they got Ibori back to the UK. He'd fled to Dubai, and Dubai had no hesitation in extraditing him. First time it had happened, but I think they probably felt that it was a win-win situation as far as they were concerned. So these are some of his other properties. Some of these very ordinary-looking properties in many ways. It was sort of quite clever of him, I suppose, to invest in ordinary properties. But one of them was interesting. This one, which was down in the country in Dorset. And why did he buy a country house? Because his children were being educated at a school nearby, and so this was going to be their pad. And again, I think that I'm afraid that our expensive schools and universities, they should be carrying out money laundering checks when they have these extremely rich pupils coming to them. And of course, our education sector is heavily dependent on these rich overseas students. But what money laundering checks are carried out on their parents, those paying the fees? Very few, I suggest. And that won't be a popular suggestion, but it should be. Yes, the judge said that 50 million was probably ludicrously low for the monies that he had stolen. The estimates go up to 300 million or even 3 billion from the period that he was in office. And I think that it's a story which will probably run and run. Well, he's in jail for 13 years. No, he's not. He'll be in jail for about 8 years. But it will at least give time for investigations to be carried out. And the final note to strike on this is that the UK has repeatedly promised that this money would be returned to Nigeria. Well, it was stolen from Delta State. Who is now in charge of Delta State? James Ibori's cousin. And I have been told that if the money does go back to Delta State, it'll only take 6 months for it to be back in James Ibori's pocket. So that is another problem which our DFID is wrestling with at the moment. How do you get these funds back into legitimate hands? And that is not an easy one to answer. Okay, my time is certainly up and overrun, so thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.